The day after President Biden publicly said that Democrats making fundamental changes to the Supreme Court would politicize it forever, the already heavily politicized Supreme Court bent over backwards to strike down his student debt forgiveness plan, prompting Biden to look for a third option. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. All right, folks, brace yourselves, because here at Pondering Politics, we are about to criticize, gently but firmly, President Biden. Now, again, I make no bones about it. I am an unapologetic progressive and the closest proxy to the progressive movement in formal politics, and this duopoly is the Democratic Party. So very often I'm disappointed in the Democratic Party because progressives are not exactly the driving force in the party. That said, even though President Biden was not my first choice in the 2020 primary, because I do think left to his own devices, he's much more of an establishment centrist than I would like. He has governed, relatively speaking, much more progressively than I expected, much more successfully bipartisanly than I suspected, and he's arguably the most progressive president. His administration is the most progressive administration in modern U.S. history. So I'll give him kudos there. And much of that, with all due respect to President Biden, is actually attributable to the Progressive Caucus, Justice Democrats, and others in both chambers, because President Biden is susceptible to being pushed successfully by progressives. He's not simply beholden to centrists and moderates, even though I'm sure his instinct is more in that direction. That said, the president does some things from time to time that genuinely get under my skin. And one of them is, again, when that instinct towards the fetishization of institutions manifests itself. See, I like President Biden. I prefer dark Brandon. That's the kind of energy that I, as a young progressive, like. That's what I would love to see more of. And quite frankly, I think whether he realizes it or not, most of his constituency want to see that fiery energy from him on a consistent basis. But then, very often he retreats to kind of establishment, just nice, jovial, hey, it's just Joe Biden, man. I'm everybody's friend for the past 50 years. Hey, what's going on? He's too generous with the benefit of the doubt very often. He, I think, very often mistakes his many surprising bipartisan successes as the norm instead of the exception, when they are still, in fact, the exception, right? Every time he has a bipartisan win, there's like one or two bipartisan failures. You see what I'm saying? So it's not to take anything away from him, but, it's just his sense of expectations, I think, are not reasonable. And so he did an interview, a surprising interview. I think it was with Nicole Wallace. I think that's her name, on MSNBC, in the aftermath of some Supreme Court decisions yesterday. And he made this comment about the Supreme Court and in the context of making changes to the court, because, of course, right now it has a 6-3 conservative supermajority. So I want to play this clip and let the president speak for himself.
You worry that without court reform, this conservative majority is too young and too conservative, that they might do too much harm?
Well, I think they may do too much harm. But I think if we start the process of trying to expand the court, we're going to politicize it maybe forever in a way that is not healthy.
That you can't get back.
That you can't get back. And I think maybe it's just the optimist in me. I think that some of the court are beginning to realize their legitimacy is being questioned in ways that hadn't been questioned in the past. And I think there's a concern on some, maybe even the Chief Justice, that maybe we better.
Well, in the independent legislature's decision, it looks like maybe Roberts had that in mind.
I don't know that.
I don't either. But you could, the optimist could hope so, right?
Hope so.
So this was in the aftermath of the Moore v. Harper decision, in which, again, mercifully, the liberals on the court, the progressive justices, were joined by 3 conservative justices, including Chief Justice Robert, to at least allow democracy another day. They refused the stupid bad faith Republican conservative argument, like, hey, you should just let Republican legislatures just do literally whatever they want in terms of election laws for federal elections. So they could literally, these Republican conservatives argue, the state legislatures in these red states can draw maps that basically, completely gerrymander their whatever liberal constituency they have into oblivion, and state governors and state Supreme Courts shouldn't be able to weigh in at all. And even this Supreme Court was like, dude, that's really excessive. Just chill, okay? So that's the independent state legislature thing that they were referencing. But again, President Biden's like, yeah, I think they could do harm, but I think that if we begin the process, and he kind of volunteered it unprompted, the specific policy of court packing, if we do that, we would politicize it forever. Now, the frustration is this is a political body. Like, we pay lip service to the idea that the Supreme Court is apolitical. But if it ever was, which that's a big if, it is no longer, right? And arguably it never was in the first place, because the way that the Supreme Court is appointed is you have the president nominate a person, the president being the country's chief political appointee, right? It's a politician elected, coast to coast by all 50 states, and then confirmed or rejected by one of the two chambers in the state legislature, the Senate, also comprised of political representatives. So it's inherently political. We have this lofty idea that, they don't have to be reelected, or technically they're not elected, they're appointed, and then they never have to be reelected. There are no term limits. They don't have to campaign. So the theory was, you get a jurist of considerable integrity, and they will believe and behave independently. But every president, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, since time immemorial, has chosen as its appointees people for very specific reasons. I can't think of a time that a conservative president picked a liberal judge, or vice versa, right? Maybe some moderates, but it's not like President Biden's going to go out and pick, the next Justice Scalia. It's not like Donald Trump was ever going to pick, the next Ruth Bader Ginsburg or anything. So there's an inherent political strain to the Supreme Court, and pretending that it doesn't exist is ridiculous. I think what we're seeing now is simply just the mask slipping off, right? Whereas once upon a time, the court bent over backwards to try to maintain the veneer of a politicization, so being apolitical. They're just kind of more obvious about it, and they're more reticent to change. And I was actually going to lean into, the president's remarks about in the aftermath of the decision today for the decision which shut down his student loan plan. I'll probably do a fourth video, probably going to do that as a separate one, because I want to conclude with this. And I actually had a really spirited debate on Twitter today with a conservative I've sparred with before, who's an attorney himself, very smart guy named Lactoid. And we got on the subject of separation of powers. Just want to remind everybody, separation of powers is meant to apply every which way, right? The notion of separation of powers is that you have three co-equal branches, right? Each with their own lane, right? Or portfolio of responsibility, whatever you want to call it. The legislative branch, which creates the laws. You've got the executive branch, which enforces the laws. And then you have the judicial branch, which interprets the laws. And each of them are supposed to be able to interfere with the other in certain ways so that nobody has absolute power, even in their own field. Like, for example, the president's the commander-in-chief of the military, right? But Congress and the courts can interfere to some extent in what the president can do with the military, right? And it's the same thing. So the idea is that they all should be able to influence each other. It shouldn't be, separation of powers doesn't mean that the Supreme Court can interfere with the executive branch and even with Congress, but they can't interfere with the Supreme Court. And right now there's this notion, I think among the Supreme Court itself, that they're exempt from interference from the other branches. Like we have Supreme Court justices who don't believe that Congress has the right to impose ethical guidelines and regulations demanding the Supreme Court justices behave under the same code of ethics that other courts do, even federal courts. The Supreme Court's basically like, no, you don't have the power to tell me that. Well, it's like, okay, wait a minute. So you have the power to tell Congress that their laws are unconstitutional, strike them down whenever you want, but Congress doesn't have the right to regulate your behavior. No, it's supposed to be, not to borrow this word, it's supposed to be an incestuous situation between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. One is not all powerful. It's not like a hierarchy where the judicial branch is on top and then comes Congress and then comes the president. No. You're all supposed to be able to influence the actions of one another. And the Supreme Court is supposed to be no exception to this. So I'm frustrated that President Biden just immediately basically lays it on the table and says, nah, I'm not going to court pack. Well, even if you don't want to court pack, Mr. President, you shouldn't announce that to the world. You should make the Supreme Court sweat a bit. You should make this Supreme Court, which has a 6-3 conservative supermajority, which often abandons originalism and textualism. What would the founding fathers think? And then they abandon it the moment it's convenient just to get a typical right-wing outcome. A majority that you could argue is illegitimate. Number one, because confidence in the Supreme Court is lower than the presidency and in Congress, right? But on top of that 6-3 conservative supermajority only exists because of Republican bad faith. In 2016, there was an appointment, and Republicans refused to fill it because Obama was the appointee, or the one making the nomination. They refused to even have a hearing. They broke a norm to do it. They held it open for the next president, Trump. Then they filled it. And to fill it, they used a nuclear carve-out, which instead of having a supermajority of Senate votes to confirm a Supreme Court nominee, then they just did it with a bare majority. So it's the second norm they broke. And then in 2020, to fill the third vacancy with Amy Coney Barrett, they broke the first norm, which is, hey, we don't have judicial hearings or Supreme Court hearings in an election year. That was what they said in 2016 to justify not giving Obama a hearing. But then when it's Trump's election year and it's a month out from the election, they don't care. So whatever you feel about changing norms, and I know a lot of people hesitate to do it, there's no reason for, even if Biden has absolutely no intention of ever messing with the Supreme Court, for God's sakes, don't tell them that. It's like poker, man. Bluff. Leave it ambiguous. Let them read into every single damn thing that you do, especially if you think that right now one of the checks on the court is that they're worrying about their legitimacy. So if you think fear is a motivator for this court, and that's one of the reasons that they may have decided a certain way on Moore v. Harper, well, keep them afraid. Keep them afraid. Maybe they'll hesitate to revoke, rights from the LGBTQ community, or perhaps they'll hesitate to gut voting rights protections for minority, or maybe they'll hesitate on the next thing. So that's what I'd like to see from President Biden more. And again, we'll do another video about his third way for getting around or trying to bring some sort of student debt relief to the American people after this decision.